All right, let's just dive right in. What if I told you that for pretty much the last 90 years, the United States has been running under a continuous state of national emergency, and in the process, kind of sidestepping the Constitution? That is the absolutely explosive claim at the heart of the analysis we're breaking down today.
Now, I know what you're thinking. That sounds like something straight out of a conspiracy forum, right? But the evidence we're about to look at, it actually comes directly from congressional records. So the big question is, has the U.S. been in a permanent state of emergency? Well, according to the source material we're examining, the answer is a pretty shocking yes. And get this, the claim is that this all started way, way back in 1933. Just let that sink in for a second. To really get our heads around how our source even arrives at that date, we've got to look at the evidence they lay out. Okay, so let's start by digging into the factual record, just as it's laid out in the source material. Think of this part as us looking at the evidence in a case. You know, what documents, what events form the foundation for this entire argument. This is where it gets really interesting. The biggest bombshell, the most powerful piece of evidence presented, actually comes from Congress itself. A 1973 Senate report made a truly stunning admission. For the 40 years before that, the U.S. had been governed, and I'm quoting here, without reference to normal constitutional processes, all under an unbroken state of emergency. So this timeline really puts it all into perspective. It kicks off in 1933 with the Emergency Banking Act, and then, according to that very same Senate report, just keeps going, uninterrupted, for 40 straight years. It really makes you start to wonder about the definition of the word emergency, doesn't it? So let's talk about that 1933 Act, the one that kicked this whole thing off. What was the deal with it? Well, according to the congressional record, which is what our source points to, the way it was passed was, let's just say, highly unusual. The bill was reportedly rushed through so fast that members didn't even get to read it. Debate was cut off after just 40 minutes, and demands for a proper recorded vote were denied. This context is absolutely critical to the source's argument that the process itself was just not normal. And this right here, this is the core conflict of the entire argument. The Constitution is crystal clear. The only right that can be suspended in an emergency is habeas corpus. That's your right to challenge your detention in court, and only then during a rebellion or an invasion. And yet, on the other hand, you have the Senate admitting to operating completely outside the normal constitutional framework. That's not just a discrepancy, that's a massive chasm. Okay, so we've seen the factual claim, but what does the Constitution itself, the ultimate rulebook, actually have to say about all this? Let's dive into the controlling authority that the source argues was basically ignored. You know, the bedrock of this entire argument is the Supremacy Clause. This is the big one. It's the part of the Constitution that basically says, hey, I'm the boss. It is the absolute highest law in the land. Nothing, not a statute, not an executive order, nothing can legally override it. It's the ultimate measuring stick for everything. This source then points to these specific guardrails built right into the system. You've got Article 1, which says only Congress can make laws. The 10th Amendment says any powers not specifically given to the federal government belong to the people. And then look at the First Amendment. It says Congress shall make no law. The source really hammers this point, arguing that there's no asterisk there, no fine print that says unless there's an emergency. So you might be wondering, okay, but how is this supposed to be enforced? Well, there's a huge legal tool for that, established way back in 1803. The landmark Supreme Court case Marbury v. Madison set the principle that any law or act that goes against the Constitution is, by its very definition, void. It has no legal force. This isn't some fringe idea, it's a foundational principle of American law. Okay, so we have the facts, and we have the rules. Now, let's put them together and walk through the source's conclusion, which they argue is pretty much inescapable. The entire argument really hinges on this one central premise. You can read the Constitution forwards, backwards, and upside down, but you will not find a single clause that gives the government permission to suspend it, not even in a crisis. With that one specific exception for habeas corpus, the document provides no emergency off switch. So let's just break down the logic here step by step. 1. The Constitution has no emergency override clause. 2. Congress itself admitted to governing outside the normal constitutional process. 3. Therefore, that governance had no constitutional authority. Which, of course, leads to the final, really powerful implication. If the authority was invalid, then what does that say about all the actions taken under that authority? And that brings us right to the source's final verdict. By applying the rulebook of the Constitution to the factual record, including Congress's very own admissions, the analysis concludes that the entire system of emergency governments after 1933 was operating without a valid constitutional foundation.
So, what does this all mean? At the end of the day, the source leaves us with this really big, provocative question. What are the implications when any government, anywhere, starts operating outside of its own founding document? It's a question that gets to the very heart of what it means to live in a constitutional republic.